Welcome everyone. Okay, I think you should get a note to say accept recording and take off chat. And good morning to everyone, or whatever time of day it is for you. Welcome to this session of the PID interest group. We've got about an hour and a half, just a little less now, to talk all about persistence. And I would say a few opening words, just to. There we go. Oops. To start with, I'll just introduce, if there are any newcomers, I see quite a lot of the participants, I see quite a lot of familiar faces, but in case of familiar names. But in case not, this is the interest group for persistent identifiers. And we've built up a kind of tradition of meeting at every plenary and really covering all sorts of topics that are potentially of interest to anyone who's interested in persistent identifiers. The last few plenaries, we've tended to have short updates from different projects. There are projects across all of RDA and beyond that are relevant, and we've had 5-minute updates, and we've done that. And this time we thought as co-chairs, let's try something slightly different. And I'll come to a moment why we chose this one. But really, this is a place to ask questions, to discuss, to query experts. We try and gather experts at every plenary on persistent identifiers. And so if you are new to this group, please feel free to ask any questions. If you'd use the chat for that during the session, the Zoom chat, that would be appreciated. Afterwards, when the session's finished, there is a chat on the Huova app or the conference platform. There is a chat that's associated with each group. So if you chat onto that, it's specific to persistent identifiers. And otherwise, you could use we have a group on RDA and the group email and chat available to you as well. I'm going to be so as participants, you're free to listen, but you're most encouraged to comment and to chat and to ask questions. This is an open Zoom platform, so you can just unmute and speak. Give us a warning perhaps, but you're more than happy to jump in at any time. I'll keep track of time. So just to go to this meeting, all about persistence. One of the, and I've showed this slide quite a lot of times, and it's not particularly this slide, but the 5 persistencies of Andrew Trelaw, who really looked at this and said, well, okay, what do we mean by persistence? And so I tried to put it into a bit of a graphic. If you think of the absolute basic system, you've got an object, some object somewhere, physical or otherwise. It's being identified uniquely with an identifier. It's somehow bound. There's a binding between the identifier and the object, some link between it. And there's a resolution service to it. So there's a way to resolve from the identifier to the object. And if you look at all the players here, Andrew's sort of way of thinking, and this is some years ago now, but I think it's still valid, is what do we mean by persistence? What are we talking about in persistence? And is it the object, the thing that's being identified? Is it the identifier as a thing? Is it the binding between them? Because if that breaks, then how do we know where to find it? But if there's a service running the resolution, and most of the persistent identifiers there is, that service has to be up and running all the time to allow for the resolution. And of course, there's also the binding needs to be updated. And if the object moves, with a lot of the identifiers in the scope of this, we've got some kind of abstraction. And so the binding needs to be kept up to date. So that was his 5. There might be more, and that's one question I have for everyone, is whether there's something missing in this. We've within the so I'm managing agent of the DOI Foundation. I didn't introduce myself. Jonathan Clark, also the co-chair here, and we've used this really to take a look at our persistence and of each angle, and what are we doing to be persistent. question I have, so one question for the group and for the panelists is have we covered everything, and what are the aspects to persistency that we need to care about? The other thing that struck me, and this is a comment from a few of the members of the interest group, is years and years ago, and I think this was the Data Fabric group, not PID, but they came up with it was necessary to come up with some set of criteria for what do we mean when we talk about a trustworthy system, and they came up with these criteria. And really, this is an open question to the group. Would it be helpful for us to develop something like this for persistence, whether it's criteria, guidelines, things to think about, best practices? Maybe there's something out there that we haven't found yet. I know that EOSC is thinking about this. Perhaps that's something we can adopt as good practice, but that's an open question that I'd like to address a little bit later. Oops, going free. Just before we start, a pitch for the collaborative notes. It's in the chat, the link. Please take a moment to go there now. You'll find it. Martin posted it early. I'll post it again right now. There it is. If you could go there now, please, and sign in. That's very helpful, just in case there are questions and things. I'm trying to moderate and take notes at the same time. So it's very helpful if you can write thoughts down on the collaborative notes. But first of all, put your name in, your email address, your affiliation, and I've just added a key question just to get everyone warmed up on the topic. And as I said, I can't, it's difficult for me to take notes through the session, so you could really help me by adding anything that you have. I put some headings down under the discussion, but really feel free to write anything that you feel is helpful for everyone. Okay. So the way the agenda is going to work, I've just done quick introductions. I'll just pause in a second for questions on that. And then we have a panel of experts who are going to talk briefly and give us their perspective on persistence. And that's Maggie, Martin, Britta, Tom, and Ulrich. So they'll introduce themselves in a second. And then we'll move to discussion. I'd really like the most of today's session to be around the discussion and to engage you all. So when I shut up in a moment, I'll be on the chat trying to trigger questions. I hope that's clear. Let me just check the chat. Yeah, Francois says, what's missing is the meaning of persistence itself in times of timescale. Yeah, that's a really good point. I think some will address that. Okay, super. Let's go on. Maggie, are you ready?
Yes, sir.
Okay, fantastic. Go ahead.
Okay, so yeah, so good morning, everybody. My name is Maggie Hellström. I work as a research data management resource at the Carbon Portal, which is the data center of ICOS, Integrated Carbon Observation System. And that's a research infrastructure, European RI, which is concerned very much with environmental and earth science. So my comments today about persistence is going to be coming very much from the perspective of these research infrastructures. So larger organizations that are concerned with not doing research themselves, but facilitating research, for instance, by collecting or producing data that then can be used by scientists, or could also be hosting different types of services like access to facilities or computational resources and things like that. So one thing that is a little bit special about environmental and earth sciences is that it's very much concerned about processes and conditions that are specific to time, space, and some theme. So it's we are looking at snapshots of reality and trying to document that and look at it, understand it in different points of view. So it's basically impossible to repeat consistently a given measurement because we can't go back to that exact moment in time. And so very early on, persistence in the environmental sciences was much about persistence of the data and metadata associated to how you had collected this information. So storing that, and not so much about making it fair or accessible or understandable even by others than the ones that had collected it. But of course, now that we are these infrastructures, we really need to focus also on fairness, on finding people should be able to find, access the data, the data itself, and the metadata should be interoperable with other standards and other measurements also from other disciplines. And reuse is extremely important. So we need to make sure that everything is well documented in provenance, and that there's also a continued access to all the information that is needed. So here, persistent identifiers have started to, of course, play an increasingly important role. We are registering and giving persistent identifiers to more and more of the research objects, or the digital research objects that we come across and that we manage. So focus has now then shifted from just storing to also making sure that all the pieces are well documented and that the information is there. But now we are taking a further step, and that is to support machine actionability of all the resources. So it really means that we need to increasingly assign persistent identifiers that are resolvable then, and that the output that comes back when you resolve the identifiers is completely understandable by a machine-driven process. And that's not maybe so difficult to achieve, but in my mind, the real key question here is, how do we make sure that all of this resolving, that all the pieces that we need in the puzzle, in this machine actionable supported puzzle, are there, even in the short term, because certain registries may disappear because funding is lost, or some information may simply be deleted by mistake or something. So should we be making snapshots of all of these links and the information inside the links? Do we need to start doing that and then curate those, or should we just accept the fact that it's life, that maybe some data will not be usable even, say, 5 years down the line? So that's a bit of a provocative question, and I'll end with that. Thank you.
Okay,
great. Thank you very much, Maggie. Just pause for 1 second, Martin, sorry. Any direct questions to Maggie? What I'm picking up there is really this kind of blending of, so some of the things you were saying reminded me a lot of the digital preservation community. IPRES, I attended those meetings for a while, and they have a lot of kind of similar issues: what to preserve, how to preserve it, do we take snapshots? It's interesting that those two come together, perhaps. Okay. Just before we go on to Martin, I didn't see so we have 3 co-chairs on this interest group: myself, Laurel Hack, and Adrian Burton. Laurel's going to join the second session, which will be in a week's time, but Adrian is lurking, and I didn't see him come in. I apologize, otherwise I'd have introduced him before. But do you want to say hi, Adrian, and just so everyone can...
Hello, everyone. Yep, great to be here. Sorry, I've got a concurrent session that I'm meant to be presenting in, so I'm just ducking in and out.
Super, thanks very much. Okay, Martin, over to you. I didn't see any questions to Maggie, so we'll go straight on.
Thank you, Jonathan. My name is Martin Fenner. I work for a small company called Front Matters since August, but I have spent, I guess, enough time with persistent identifiers that Jonathan dared to invite me. And I want to make 3 comments on persistence, because there's sort of many other issues that are important for PIDs in terms of infrastructure, but specifically on persistence, I have 3 thoughts. The first one being, and that's also a question that Francois has raised, what is the timescale we are talking about? Is it 1 year? Is it, I picked 1 year, 10 years, and 100 years as sort of different scenarios. And the interesting fact is that the persistent identifiers we are mostly talking about in this session and in this community, they are really not older than 20 years. And that's mainly, of course, because they rely on digital technology that wasn't really widely available before the 1990s, which means that some communities, and Jonathan mentioned preservation, they think in very different timescales. So for them, 20 years is sort of, I don't know, almost nothing. And strategies that have been developed to work much longer have to take a slightly different approach. This doesn't mean persistence. This community has no right to talk about persistence because we are just very young, but it's just meaning that sort of some of the issues that come up once you talk about 20 years, 50 years, etc., they're probably not the focus of the PID community. And there is more work needed to sort of work together with the preservation community. And as Jonathan mentioned, there has been a lot of, I think, useful conversation, but there's probably more gaps to sort of think in different mindsets. The second point I want to make is if you worry about persistence, what are the factors that guarantee persistence? And I saw some comments before the session, and I think that's general agreement. The basic problem is not technology for making basically the graph that Jonathan showed a bit earlier, make that work, that all these things are connected. And there's no interruptions or data lost, but the biggest issue is something else. I think what's very helpful in this conversation is POSI, the principles of open scholarly infrastructure, which are of course not only about persistent identifiers, but that's a very good fit of the challenges the community faces. POSI has a number of principles in three categories. One is governance, which is both who has to decide what to do, but also it's about the business model that supports this infrastructure. And the second category is sorry, I'm blinking there. Is sustainability, which I sort of mentioned already. And the third one is insurance, where insurance means not sort of insurance in a traditional sense, but what happens if this organization goes under or can no longer function properly, that all the data are openly available and you can get them in other ways, and also that the software to run this infrastructure is open source and you can fork it and run it yourself. So basically persistence. And Jonathan put a link to the POSI pages up there. This is a document that started a few years ago, but has been sort of refined and formally adopted by Crossref last year. And there are a few organizations that have signed since, some of them persistent identifier providers, but also other infrastructure organizations. And that's I think is very helpful to think about what kind of things are needed to guarantee persistence. And that's there are obvious things there. So something that is also very much in the spirit of RDA and what all the organizations involved here follow is that this is non-profit organizations that have a membership model where there's a governance structure, so that decisions are done in a formal and open way, and it's not some random person that decides that starting January 1st, something happens that might be controversial. Okay, so that's maybe a point for more discussion in the session or in other places. And the third point I want to make is the challenge that persistent identifier infrastructure is almost by definition borrowing and not changing. And how do you combine this with doing things differently? And I think for PIDs, there's sort of interesting developments in the last few years where new services show up and new ways of doing things. And how do you combine this with not breaking things that exist, and how you transition from what everybody's doing now to something new. So if there's a cool new thing and that's very exciting, but nobody knows whether this will be around 3 years later, should you wait, or these kinds of questions? And that's more an open question, and that's yeah, that ends my comments. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Martin. Thanks very much for that. Yeah, I put a link into what you mentioned, and someone has already put on the collaborative notes. We should think about governance. So let's put a plug to come back to that. Any specific questions to Martin before we go on to Britta? Either chat them or open up your link and talk. I'm just going to share the screen again, so because Britta has a slide. Bear with me while it's loading. There we go. Does everyone see it? Persistence takes a village.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Jonathan.
Great. Britta, please, over to you.
Yes, thank you. I'm Britta Dreyer. I'm the head of PID and metadata services at TIB, and I'm also DataCite's business manager. And I prepared a slide, and I would like to make the point that persistence takes a village. And you see the terms here: PID provider, PID manager, PID owner, and PID user, which I think came up firstly in a scoping paper. And some of you are in this expert group for the knowledge exchange, where consultants are now investigating the risk and trust issues of a functional PID infrastructure. So these are terms that I'm using now throughout my little presentation. Well, the point I'd like to make is that it is much more than technology. It takes organizations, people that are committed and share a central focus, come together in a village. And the PID providers basically have built an open community-based interoperable PID infrastructure. And these PIDs, and these are just, this is not an inclusive list of PIDs for people, organizations, and various research inputs. But I'd like to focus in this little introduction on the stakeholders in the DOI village. Stepping back, so the DOI system, as you know, is administered by the IDF, and alongside the technical infrastructure, there are policies and procedures that are governing the process of DOI registration. The IDF members, the DOI registration agencies, are international membership organizations, and together they are supporting the goals of the IDF and ensuring that the DOI system is an internationally adopted standard for digital object identification. Crossref, KISTI, and JALC, all DOI registration agencies, are also members of DataCite, and we closely cooperate in this. So the DataCite membership is open to research organizations around the globe. And this is evaluated in the application before the membership application is processed. They need to demonstrate an elevated level of commitment to open data and open research. We make sure that they understand the long-term commitment that comes with persistent identifiers like DOIs. So currently DataCite is working with 202 direct members and with 749 research organizations through 45 consortia in 48 countries. And the members of DataCite here are called PID managers, and they oblige to the rules and regulations as laid out in the DataCite statutes. So this is the main governing document, and basically describes all the rules and regulations and responsibilities of the governing organs of DataCite. And these statutes in turn incorporate the IDF policies. And the use of the DOI registration services are then again regulated by terms and conditions. And these terms and conditions include the commitment to data persistence. Also, forms and preventive measures for the data to disappear. For example, we added a description and a way to basically perceive and store the underlying data in archives. And there are other terms that basically ensure persistence of both the metadata, the DOI, making sure that the resolution remains intact, etc. And TIB on the side of a PID manager is basically leading a DOI consortium in Germany. And we again have agreements in place that are based on the DataCite membership agreement. And we also make sure in our application process that our member organizations understand the long-term commitment. So we have a team of 5 that is providing support around all PID and metadata related topics. And we are also consistently and continuously enhancing these services based on the community needs. So we all are supporting research organizations and infrastructure providers that are implementing these PIDs in their various systems and services. And we all know that concepts like data management, data stewardship, and the fair data principles have gained traction, and they all are reliant on infrastructure and mainly on guidance, policy, based on community standards and best practices. And they are inclusive of these governance structures, trained personnel, and long-term resourcing. And this forms the ideal framework for trustworthy repositories. And they are in this little slide, the PID owners in the bottom, and they play a very important role here. They are basically they have the authority to create the DOI and to provide and maintain the DOI metadata, and including the location of the research object, that URL that comes with every DOI that points to the location. And they are responsible for the metadata quality, the long-term availability, accessibility, and integrity of the data. And these trusted repositories play this key role in implementing these fair data principles. And they are creating these functional, trustworthy environments for research workflows that support the PID user, the researchers. And the adoption rate determines the success of these systems. And this, in turn, I believe, is important to nurture long-term commitment. Yeah, so I think these are my closing remarks. Because I really do think that the adoption of these systems is really, really important. And we have conducted an analysis, and we see that the adoption rate is increasing. But for example, the metadata completeness, which really is essential to the fair data principles, is in need of improvement here.
Lovely, thanks. Thanks, Britta. So it's really a sense of a village, a community. So and I think this applies way beyond the DOI world. And we're going to hear from Tom in a moment. But if there are any questions, there's a question to Britta from Maggie. Maggie, do you just want to ask it?
Yeah, sure. So a very nice overview, Britta. So one thing that I'm a bit concerned with is the way that the repositories such as Figshare or Zenodo or these large things where it's usually individuals who are uploading things and entering basic metadata about these objects into the system rather than a trained data steward or a librarian or something doing it on behalf of an organization. I feel that often these metadata records are either incomplete or they may need to be updated later on as more information becomes available, but nobody does it because these data owners are not even aware that they should be doing this, or they might even have lost their logins, so they can no longer even access the metadata records even if they want to. Is this something we should worry about, or is this just a drop in the ocean?
Well, I do think this is something we all worry about, and we also are not only with these systems, but with other systems. We also, as PID, excited people, we also see there's a lot of ways to improve this, and I think it is the international standards we need to agree upon, or like a small level of common understanding what these international standards can be, and provide guidance and systems that enable these researchers that are uploading their data in platforms like Zenodo, provide a means for researchers to understand what it means to enter complete metadata to them. I mean, I'm sure there are technical ways to encourage this. And I know that, for example, Dryad is a similar platform, does lots of, has implemented lots of nice additional features. For example, they're adding a raw ID to the metadata records. So maybe there are also ways for data stewards later on to enrich that metadata to make it more useful and make the data in turn more reusable.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Can I add a short comment? And that's maybe because I work for Identifiers, which is the underlying open source software that powers Zenodo. And I think that basically is repeating, of course, what Britta said, that this is a challenge for these platforms that sort of lower the barrier to register data sets, for example, that the flip side is that the metadata quality is whatever somebody enters. And I think the key word is really curation, what Dryad, for example, is doing on a small level, and of course some repositories a much more intense level. And something else that's at least relevant for Zenodo and similar platforms is something that they call communities. So that basically it's not a dropping ground where you get rid of your data and then they just disappear and you have nobody touches them anymore, but that this is a community that works on similar topics, that people know each other, and then you can build something that creates more value, and also over time, for example, Britta mentioned ROAR, if there's something new that comes up, that there might be additional work to go back to your metadata and update them. So I think that's really important, because I think at some point the idea, make it easy to register things with PIDs, was a powerful argument, but I think that's no longer true. It really, you want to provide value that doesn't come for free. So there is the investment of time and maybe resources needed.
Great, thank you. I'd like to move on to Tom. There's been some questions I've seen in the chat, but we'll get to those, I think, in the discussion. Tom. Oh, before we do that, sorry, just to plug for the collaboration. I see we've got more participants have joined, I think, since we started. So just to plug, I'll put it in again, the link. please sign yourself in and feel free to make comments in the collaborative notes. Tom.
Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, I'm Tom Demranville. I'm the product director over at ORCID. Like others have said, I think persistence is much more of a social than a technical issue. Things are only really persistent if the organizations behind them are sustainable, and having the right incentives to participate and support persistence is really the most important fundamental thing. Including the services around the PIDs that provide value and having a critical mass of users around them, also very important. And really we're looking at, you know, a combination of mission, value provided, business model, trust in the services that you provide and the governance that you have, and adoption of your services, which others have touched on as well. They're just really the keys to persistence, and it's really difficult. I mean, there's a lot of us in the room that are trying to do this, and it's just not an easy job. At ORCID, we have a strategic plan which sort of helps point us in the right direction to maintain persistence, and we split it into 4 themes. We want to be able to provide values to our members and who help sustain us. We want to provide value to researchers who are our main source of adoption and end users. We want to increase global participation, and importantly, I think very importantly, we want to maintain the trust and integrity of the system and services we provide. Now, providing values easy and hard at the same time. Working out what services to build and provide, especially around persistence with limited resources, is tricky. You just can't do everything. So you need to talk to your stakeholders to work out what's important, but stakeholders are varied and they can often conflict in their requirements. We deal with member organizations like universities, funders, publishers, and things like that, and researchers, and they don't always see eye to eye about what is desirable from a system identifier system. You know, data privacy versus data availability, for example, these kind of things. We also talk, and we're guilty of this at ORCID, and we're trying to stop doing it so much, but we talk about things like researchers, funders, and you know, librarians, for example, as if there's some kind of homogenous blob, right? Like they've got the same opinions but research and needs, but researchers really do not have the same needs. You can't just say it's a researcher, they have these requirements. It doesn't work like that. So we have to be really careful to not let one subset of these stakeholders or one kind of particularly loud stakeholder drown out the others and build the wrong things. These kind of requirements as well about what is valuable and what is useful, they don't just vary from stakeholder to stakeholder, but within a stakeholder. A university, for example, is not a single entity. It's got a library and a research office, a HR department, an IT department, and they don't always agree either on what's important. And sometimes they're actively sort of fighting against each other, which makes it difficult to talk to a university as a whole, who speaks for the university, who is the source of truth at the university about certain types of data, like who's affiliated. We see in a library, the librarians have this information, but they don't necessarily consider themselves the source of truth. They would say, well, the HR department or the research officers knows this better, but they have less interest in participating in our system. So we have to balance all these quite complex relationships of these complex beasts, which are like funders and universities. But I think it really is the last of the themes that I mentioned, that sort of the trust and integrity that underpins everything else. Your PID services has to be trusted, or you'll just have no one will participate and have nothing to persist, right? It's really the fundamental thing. It's how you start on the road to providing persistence. And if you lose trust in the things that persist, then you kind of lost the point of what you're doing, right? And you risk becoming irrelevant. If people don't trust the things you persisted, why bother persisting them in the first place? And I think 3 things really help us here build trust in our systems. And one is open and inclusive government. And again, Martin touched on this when he was talking about the principles of open scholarly infrastructure. A level playing field to participation, I think, is very important. And also just general engagement in the design of the services you're providing, right? So that they're relevant and they'll continue to be used. They won't just be forgotten about. So that's kind of my take on it. I know Laurie Hack, who's not in this session, but will be in the next session, Heather Flanagan and Laura Paglioni have just written a really good article about this and published it. And I will post that link to it in the chat because it covers an awful lot of ideas about what we're talking about today.
That's great. Thank you, Tom. Do we have any questions specifically for Tom? So for those, I see we're up to 41 participants, which is more than we started. So if you've joined us since we started, I just put a plug in the chat for the collaborative notes. Please sign in and feel free to add your comments. We're reaching the end of the panel. There's Ulrich just to come, and then I'd like to move into a discussion. Please, use the Zoom functions, raise your hand, and don't be shy. But if you prefer to chat things, I've captured a few questions and comments already in the chat, which we'll come back to. But I'd like to hand over now to Ulrich for the last of the panel introductions. Ulrich, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Jonathan, and welcome to you all here in this discussion. My name is Ulrich Schwartmann. I'm the lead of the management board of EPIC, and EPIC is a consortium of data centers working together to get us some organizational background for stability of PID services, essentially, and therefore it's of course relevant in this discussion. I would like to start first with something which is around the ideas Andrew Trelaw had made, and what Jonathan already mentioned in his introductory words. Essentially, from my point of view, it's even a bit easier. PID is just a string, nothing else, together with some basic services, essentially the binding and redirection services. That's it. And the question now is how persistence comes in. And that means that at that level, persistence can have essentially on three levels vulnerabilities. The first is, and this is something which is not in the list of Andrew as far as I can see, is already at the very beginning. The knowledge to know what the services are is something like a cultural knowledge. It's if you have a DOI system, you know that there is a resolver for that, and you know the address of it, which is currently something it's not really the resolver behind it. It's a proxy. It's inside the HTML world. And this means that already in this context, you can lose persistence in the long run. It means that the technology HTML can vanish. Over 100 years, it's even has a high probability that we will have something else then. And this knowledge, how to access these services, also is something we have to keep in mind in the long run. If we talk about 10 years, it's difficult. It's different, of course. The next question is then, are these services answering? And the third question is, are the answers correct? And this means that there is, as well as the organizational level, there is also a technical question we have to keep in mind. And I think what the DOI Foundation says is in the sentence as it is written there, it's not correct. Persistence is also dependent on technology, and therefore it's not only, I agree, it's the main point, the organizational level in the daily business is the main point, of course, but it's not the only point. We also have on the technical level, we have all these reliability of service and mirroring, this quality of service, which again goes into the direction of operation and governance. But as I said, a PID is first of all a string. We have also to look at the persistence of the string itself. The problem that if you have any kind of semantics inside the string brings a problem if a certain organization changes, for instance, the name, and you have the name inside the PID. This organization will not be able to keep the persistence in the long run. So there are a lot of technical and more or less principal questions, but also, of course, the organizational level. And there you need to ensure stability of the PID service itself, of course. This is an agreement between partners. You need the stability of the reference, which is essentially something which has to be in the responsibility of the PID owner and the manager. And you have to, and this Britta already mentioned, you have to make good contracts with these stakeholders that they keep an eye on this. And then there is something which is important also, and we also already have had this point. There should be contracts about a takeover in case of failure. So if a certain institution for whatever reason fails, and there should be others that take over this this duty, and this has to be contracted in advance. And this is essentially the reason why we started to have a consortium for persistent identifiers called EPIC. I would like to make another point, and that's about the transparency of persistence. I would like to really see from the PID itself how persistent it is. And the first step there would be that we need some, of course, some kind of certification of PID services. This can be alongside with the certification of repositories, but it's a special kind of flavor in the certification there. This has to be elaborated, and we have to work on that first, I think. And then we already had mentioned that Martin has said that we have different timescales for persistency. One could bring this into such a certification process as well. So there could be different levels in the timescale, for instance, in the certification, but also it could be possible that the technical resolution times or the organizational resolution times are different, that the access times for the objects are different, and even the access rights, of course, might be different. So these could be different flavors of certifications of PID services. And now the question is how one can see from a PID what flavor of persistence is given by the PID. And in the second step, then I would suggest that we provide this information inside the PID record. Most of the PID systems provide the possibility to add information to the PID itself, because essentially a PID is a redirection system, which means there is a database behind it, and the database usually can take more than just one value. This approach would mean that we allow for PID's kernel attributes, first of all. The second would be that this certification I was talking about should be a kind of a trusted digital certificate that refers to the PID itself. That means that we don't are fine with the certification for repositories we currently have, where a organization behind it essentially says and prints out something. We need a trusted digital certificate that directly can be machine actionably understood by machines. And alternatively, one could also say that a whole namespace could have such a certificate. That means that not the PID itself, but for instance, a whole prefix for a PID would have such a certificate. But this essentially are my ideas to go a step further in the direction of transparency for PID persistence. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Ulrich. I liked your point about having the system has to be designed to be persistent, particularly the semantics of the identifier. We come across that. Okay, so we've got about another 30, 35, 34 minutes for discussion. There's quite a lot I've captured on the chat and in the. So I don't know if anyone would like to jump in with questions, perhaps make the points in the chat. Otherwise, I can trigger some things. We've heard a lot about persistence in terms of timescale. There's around archiving, governance. Tom mentioned trust. There's incentives to keep metadata up to date, as Ulrich mentioned. Of course, the good thing about a PID is that the level of abstraction allows you to add metadata to the object, even if the original provider of the object is no longer there. You can continue to enrich it by simply linking. Ulrich just mentioned certification. I always think I like the idea very much, but I always wonder who do we trust to certify the people who should be trusted, and who does it, and how does that happen? I think that's another rich area for discussion. I think Carlo had a good question in here, and Heinrich and others. So let me just open the floor. Please raise your hand, jump in, feel free.
Shall I just
Phil,
go ahead and shall I just go ahead and pipe up? I'm not averse to doing that. All right. So one of the things that that we've found at MoreBrains is we've been doing research around persistent identifiers and information infrastructure, is that one of the biggest challenges is that when somebody enters data or metadata or a persistent identifier, very often they're not the person, they're not the stakeholder that directly benefits from entering that metadata. Somebody else does elsewhere in the ecosystem. Now, a really important example of that we've come across is that amongst researchers, the big use case that they would find the most valuable is if persistent identifiers were integrated into funder systems so that they were able to report progress on research grants. That would save them tremendous amounts of time. And right now, what's happening is people are, if they are putting information into ORCID and they are turning on their connector between Crossref and ORCID and making sure that stuff gets populated and putting stuff in their repositories and making sure that's got an identifier and doing everything that they're supposed to do, they are not seeing particularly much benefit as individual researchers, and they're having to rekey data into systems time and time and time again. Aggregated over the whole system, that's a tremendous amount of wasted time and money. We calculated in the UK economy and the UK research sector, it's wasting something like £5 million a year just in people entering metadata that could move automatically from system to system. So I think one of the big challenges is that there's been a lot of attention paid to the information architecture, but perhaps not enough attention paid to the use cases, to the user journeys, to the actual things that people, the user stories, the things that people are going to need to use the system for. And for that reason, they're not seeing enough benefit. So I think the big question is, how do we align incentives so that it's actually beneficial for individual stakeholders to participate in the PID ecosystem?
Can I chime in?
Please go ahead. Go ahead.
I think that's a really, really good point. And it's interesting there that you're talking about funding systems. So the researchers you were saying are expected to do all this work curating metadata and things like this, and they don't see this direct benefit. And it's interesting because the funder systems, they will get this reporting information. They'll certainly get the applications no matter what, right? So they're not necessarily incentivized to reduce the burden on researchers of entering that data in the first place. They want the data. So the misalignment is on both sides in terms of providing value to people to participate in the system.
Yeah, I think not immediately incentivized is the key for funders, right? Because if funders got better information and more complete, more accurate, more timely information, they would be able to make better strategic decisions about where they spend their money. And when you filter that, when you do that economic analysis, you're talking tens of millions, hundreds of millions of pounds worth of benefit, right? Because if you're making better strategic decisions, that amplifies the value of what you're doing. So that massively accelerates the impact that they make with their funding money. So they would see a direct benefit, but it's not immediate. And I think that becomes a challenge.
Yeah, and the benefit is not necessarily immediate or apparent to the people that are responsible.
Obvious, not obvious.
The decision to put these things in place, right? So it could well be a different part of the organization that will see a benefit to these systems being put in place.
Martin.
Yeah, I also want to follow up on this. I really liked what you said, Phil. I think, strictly speaking, I'm not sure this is about persistence. This is why PID systems are useful and how can we make them better, what drives that. And I totally agree with what you said. I want to give another related example, which is CVs, which I thought ORCID solves 10 years ago when it launched. The submissions to grants and all kinds of things that researchers go through, and where everybody wants a slightly different format, and of course, list of publications and affiliation change every once in a while. It's totally wasted money. And what is interesting is sort of what Tom said, that the incentives are different if you are a funder, because, and similar also if you're a publisher, because people come to you anyway, even if the hurdles are high or low, it doesn't matter because you have to apply for a grant, submit a paper or whatever. So that puts the researcher at the tail end of this. I mean, one common symptom that we all see is the solution to digitalize everything and make it faster for administrations, just to push the burden into web forms for researchers. So it's a tricky one where the obvious sort of stress you have to do and what you can, the drivers for change are not always aligned.
Thanks, Martin. Melroy.
Hello, everyone. This is Melroy here from PIF. Phil, I completely agree with what you're saying in that funders do have a responsibility of implementing persistent identifiers. However, with funders, they might choose not to do it because they're going to get the information anyways. They are the ones with the money, but when they do give out funds, they are happy to wait for about a couple of years to see the results of the money they've actually spent. So for them, it's not always necessarily the immediate benefits, but like you said, it's also the impact of doing it. The thing is, by implementing persistent identifier, and like you said, if researchers don't have to key in the same information every single time, if it is captured from different sources and directly imported into the funding systems, especially at the point of application for a fund, what that means is researchers get to spend more time on actually putting in their application and spending time on how exactly are they going to use that money that they get on the application, which means a much better quality of application for them to assess. That would then imply that they would get a greater quality of applications, which means they would shortlist much better, I guess, much better proposals in terms of their funding, which would actually see them have a much bigger impact. And it is these things that we need to do, user stories or even case studies to actually bring it up to their level, letting them know that these are some of the benefits, because there is a reason they're funding research in the first place. And to see a lot more impact out of that would be something to actually galvanize them into doing something about it, I guess. At least it seems to be working, at least now in Australia, where we've got both of our big funders actually integrating ORCID within their systems. However, only one has actively come out and said that, yes, we're doing it, whereas in the other case, it's just there on a web page. So I guess it's probably because they're not using it as much, but it is something we are trying to work with them on, trying to get them to implement it.
I know the example that Miller is talking about in Australia, and just shows that when there is benefit, then it just flows naturally. The funder that implemented the really nice ORCID linkage, within the very first year, 95% of the sort of outputs, the journal articles, CV type stuff, went in through the ORCID connection. So, you know, really, it's kind of instantaneous. When there is value, it sort of just manifests like that immediately. And I think what Phil's saying is then that makes sense to the researchers, because they're saving time, and then in the context of our conversation about sustainability, something that's useful has a lot better chance of being sustained than and persisting than one where the value is not being seen immediately. Martin, you made a little comment there saying that you thought that this group could work on a couple of were they printed? It was up towards the top of the chat there. You said it'd be good for this group to work on a number of those elements, identifying those. Do you recall that remark? And did you?
Of course, it was only minutes ago. No, I mean, you could say that there is many places where these comments are made or things collected. For example, specifically EOS, because they are sort of working on PID policies, etc. So but I think this group is a good forum for highlighting some of these things, and even if it's just collecting what others have said and agreed on, it might be useful. I mean, it's an interest group, not a working group, so it has to be within reason. But I mean, there is a lot of several people saying very similar things, so it's not a controversial topic that needs months of work. But just collecting some of this. For example, what I heard many times today is maintaining PID infrastructure is not a technical but a social problem. And maybe that's not so obvious to everyone, and it would be worthwhile to write this down somewhere. And I think there are similarly low-level points. Something else that some of this is in POSI, but it's also in other documents, is the idea that you have infrastructure that's grant funded, so only lives for the next 3 years, and then needs another decision. That's also not a good idea. And there are some other things. I think governance is also repeated, that if you have an infrastructure everybody depends on, it cannot be an infrastructure that's, for example, privately owned, or where 1 or 3 people decide the direction where it goes. So it's work, and that's not typical for an interest group, but that could be something that can provide value, which would capture some of the discussion we're having today.
Maggie?
Yeah, I just wanted to make the comment that I think that the sort of PID community is somewhat divided up in different parts, of course, because we have different views, but also because we see different uses for persistently identified objects or using persistent identifiers. And I think it's a little bit of a danger that it sort of fragments into those who are looking into these more, say, administrative type of metadata that is of primary use for CVs, funding applications, and just keeping track of who has done what on one hand. And on the other hand, those people who are really into this because they want to support machine actionable workflows, etc. There are, of course, very different types of metadata that are needed to support these different usage scenarios. And we also really need to think about where should those metadata be stored. I mean, some of it may be best stored in already at PID registry level, because that's really sort of the kernel metadata that is needed for certain technological or supporting certain technological actions. But there's a lot of much richer metadata that needs to be put in catalogs and or in other places, and that all has to be linked together so that completely different end user, be they humans or machines, can put together the puzzle and go ahead and do useful things. So that's something I think that is so good to have an interest group in RDA, because it provides a broader platform to really have common discussions on this, but also out in the communities and in the disciplines, we need to tie this tighter together, I think, because otherwise we'll end up in yet one other us and them situation, which no one benefits from.
Yeah, thanks, Maggie. There was a comment by Vanessa in the chat about, are we keeping track of the distributed W3C, the distributed identifier? And I think the honest answer to that is not really. And I think I'm not quite sure. There's something perhaps as co-chairs we need to think, how do maybe we do a session that looks at that, something to note, because that's definitely a community that I don't think we've heard from here. And inclusivity in general, I think, is really important. Francoise.
So yes, I was wondering about what the RDA can bring in the discussion, because we have seen information about documents and places where these things are discussed, and you just said that someone just said that there are many places where these things are discussed. So RDA has both sociological and technical aspects, basically deals with the two aspects. I was wondering, I am a bit surprised, but is there somewhere a document, an informed document about use cases for PIDs? I am surprised if this does not exist, because it's the kind of things, the interest groups can produce documents, and the reference documents, which are also outputs of the RDA. So I am wondering if there is a document which would be to the point, using RDA capacities to bring people with different points of view. So this could be one of the things to be done if it does not exist. And I am surprised if it does not exist.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'll look. I don't think implicitly there are some basic use cases, but I'm not sure anything has been documented. I'll go back into our archives and see. Yes,
I think it would be useful to have something, because this came back. Here you have many. I am not a specialist of PIDs, so I am mostly listening, and I have the impression that even for you, all the specialists of the question, you always come back to use cases and so on. And I think you put the comment in the discussion. So if I see that event, I think I saw that Freya probably did something, but Freya is a specific project. And if there is a document as a starting point which can be shared and which can lead to a more general document, it could be a useful output. Listening to you, I have the impression the document would be useful.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I had a hunch that that's essentially why we wanted to set up this session. Is I have a feeling that some kind of documentation here might be useful, whether it's about persistence or use cases, something that notes these, because I do think there are some best practices here that each of the services that have spoken here have said what they do, and collecting that together in one place, I personally do think it's useful. That's part of what I was looking for, some support from the group, whether that's something that because we're a bunch of volunteers, so we'll have to make that. On the other hand, there is some funding becoming available that might help us do this. So that's sort of the reason for this whole session. Martin.
Yeah, I commented in the chat on sort of Francois' question, which is sort of seconding Maggie, that I think these use cases have been collected in RDA, but sort of in a decentralized way, because they might be quite specific for the various working in interest groups. That's sort of because PID because it's infrastructure, it helps in many different ways and has been sort of probably worked on more detail, but of course there is value in bringing this together in a central place. The other comment I wanted to make is, which we might not have enough time today, but if we talk about persistence, then I think something that would be worth exploring more is the boundary to identifiers that are not persistent, and sort of various initiatives that are sort of in a gray area where you have an identifier for a project, but so it's useful for the next few months, but you're not saying this is still around in 2 years or whatever. And there are sort of various, there's a lot of gray area for me that could be clearer in where, for example, when you should use some PIDs definitely don't work at all if they disappear after a year, where for others it's fine, and just sort of clarifying this a little bit more, because or in a broader sense, what I said in my presentation of what are we talking about when we talk about persistence? Do we want to use this PID for the next 12 months, for the next 10 years, for the next 100 years, and whatever? That requires very different systems. But again, that's more something for a future conversation, I guess, because we are 10 minutes or so towards the end.
Thanks, Martin. There was a lot on the chat that I don't I've been scrolling through it thinking who'd like to talk. Adam, you had quite a lot to say. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Hi, Jonathan, thanks.
Hi.
Yeah, I think the only real thing from all the stuff that's been said already that I'd like to add is from the stuff I put in the chat, it's important that we look again at both the social model of persistence and how that is brought into the longer tail and smaller communities, the global south. One of the issues that we've been having at the minute in some of the forums that I've been involved with is just how to address getting that inclusion and equity. You know, the point's been made before that some of the information networks that we're relying on have great participation from larger organizations, global north, but what we want is all the information. And we're missing stuff. We're missing stuff that could be crucial, could be vital. We can't find it, and we need to work with all of the partners and bring in new partners to get more of that information brought in. And again, we need to figure out mechanisms both in social action and in infrastructure itself. So there's interop questions around just simple stuff like language. I say simple, you know, simple to describe, not in any way ever simple to actually enact. but also, you know, actually figuring out modes of participation and inclusiveness in fora like this and other places.
Yeah, thank you, Adam. I was noting that I think it was Tom mentioned trust and open. One of the things, a lot of the organization, a lot of the services are provided by member organizations who, of course, have a duty. They're funded by their members, so they have a duty to listen to their members, and that automatically creates this. I don't want to say an echo chamber, but this sense of the community is limited by the people who are members supporting the infrastructure. And I think it's a struggle to figure out, and I know you and I have talked about this struggle to break out of that and try and reach out to people who are not yet part of the community. It's one of the kind of dilemmas. You have a well-run governance, a good group of stakeholders, everyone's engaged, but by definition, it excludes a bunch of people who are on the outside. And I think that's a really interesting discussion to have. How can we be more inclusive? And this is one of the things I think the interest group here tries at least to address. Okay, we've got another 10 minutes, time for some closing remarks, I think, from people, if you'd like. And then I'll wrap up right at the very end. So open the floor again. Who'd like to speak? Francois.
Yes, I can say what I wrote in the chat. It is possible to ask, you know, there is a list, a mailing list for group chairs, and it is possible to ask a question to the group chairs, whether, going back to the use case story, whether they have use cases for PIDs, and to see what happens. And there is also the possibility to organize a meeting at some point in the coming months to gather the people who could be interested to provide a use case. I think I remembered Rainer Stotzka had a use case repository somewhere on the RDA website, but I am not sure that it is still used. But there could be a gathering of use cases by this group if you think it is interesting. And again, if you don't find somewhere hidden in your documentation a beautiful use case document.
Well, I'm pretty sure. So I know a lot of working groups, their initial, so the data fabric started by collecting use cases right at the early stages. That was the first step in that work before it became a larger group. That was the first step. So there will be something. I'll take a look.
But in any case, it can be a document which is somewhere in the, well, you can put documents in your own web, in the group web page, you know, there is a place where you can put documents. And it can be a way to gather your own use cases eventually.
And the JISC people have done some really nice work on workflow, you know, scholarly workflows that benefit from persistent identifiers in general. So that's more than just a use case, it's sort of a whole scenario, a whole research scenario that can benefit.
And I quite like to take the outputs of this and the other session we have and try and formulate, perhaps with a small group of people, try and formulate some, well, similar to the slide I put at the front, some comments that we make. I think a lot has been said today about what persistent is, how it is, what's being done. And it would be useful to capture a lot of systems should be thinking about this. They should be thinking about archiving. They should be thinking about the timelines. And it's really just a help. I actually think that could be useful. I get quite a lot of questions about it, and I find myself repeating things and thinking this would be useful to document. Maggie.
Yeah, I was just thinking that this type of sort of gathering information and organizing it should not just be on the shoulders of you guys who are chairs or co-chairs of the interest group. I would really support forming some kind of task force or something, or maybe several task forces under the IG and try to work together. And one thing that is always an issue for me is that I as I put in the chat while preparing for this meeting, I just was digging through my own repository of articles that I had about PIDs, and I found all these brilliant articles, just as an example, from that Data Science Journal thematic issue from 2017. And so much that was said then is still so true today, but it's like we keep forgetting it and start reinventing the wheel again. So I don't know how to get around that, because PIDs is really expanding into a very broad and very, very engaging fields. But we shouldn't forget that a lot of good thinking has already been done. Maybe we should just collect it and start acting on it.
Yeah, good point. Okay, I'm going to have to, we've got 5 more minutes. I'm going to save the chat so I can add it to the collaborative notes. Please feel free, that's of course open. So if there's something that something that's on your mind that you didn't have time to say, or is something you reflect on after the session, feel free to add. As I said, there is a second session in a week's time, and somehow I'll try and take the insights from all of that and report it back. So I'd like to thank you. Just hang on a minute, make sure I save the chat. Yep. And stop the recording. I have to remember to do those. So just remains to thank the panelists very much. Thank you all for your engagement. There's tremendous insights in the chats and in collaborative notes. So thank you all very much. Wish you a good RDA and see you on another session.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Yeah.
It was a good way to begin the RDA. Thank you very much.
Thank you, François. That's great. And great to see you, Adrian. I'm glad you joined. I'll see you again in a week's time.
Yep. See you then.
Thanks, Jonathan. Goodbye.
Thanks to all the panelists.
Okay.
You did a great job.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Jonathan, sorry, just
Hillary, yes.
Hi.
You joined. I saw you. Hi.
Well,
I saw you joined.
In fact, I wrote the email to you while I was as you reminded me. Oh, I have a head like a sieve. I was just saying to Bridget before I forgot. Do you know, I woke up this morning and remembered that I had arranged a meeting with somebody. Like I'd never spoke to them before. I thought, when was that meeting? It was a week ago. I never saw the calendar invite. It never came. I checked back my emails. So anyway. So I heard you say that, and I just wrote back. And while we're here, I wanted to say to you, so basically I think, yeah, definitely we can support it. The only problem with this funding is there has to be some connection with EOSC. We need to say there's impact, but with the PID stuff there is, so that's okay. And then the timing, we need to see, they've stalled us a little bit, right? There's an administrative problem between the commission and the coordinator of the project, so we're waiting for that. But I wonder, we have one called, we have a call